One of the most famous Arthurian stories from the Middle Ages is the story of King Arthur and the Giant of Mont Saint Michel. And we have this from Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 12th century. We have it from Thomas Malory in the 15th century. There are variances in the story, but it runs something like this. The daughter of the Duke of Brittany has been seized by this monstrous, powerful man, sort of ogre-like man. Maybe he's a giant who's dragged the daughter away. And King Arthur, as the greatest of all kings, is fortunately in the area with his army. And so he said, "Oh, I will go and get your daughter back." And so they head off and they find the daughter. Well, they find her grave and they find her nursemaid. And what this grotesque ogre-like creature has done to them is definitely not PG-13. Geoffrey of Monmouth pulls no punches. You absolutely know this man-creature is an utter villain at this point. So King Arthur obviously must avenge the death of the girl and protect the area from the ravages of this beast, this creature. And the creature, the giant, has already slain 20 kings who've tried to kill him before. Right, the giant has defeated 20 kings in combat and has taken their beards, which he has woven into his cloak as trophies. And so where all these other kings have failed, Arthur will succeed. And of course he has an army with him. So being King Arthur, he turns to his army and says, "You lot stay here. I'm going to do this on my own. Or maybe I'll take a couple of my knights with me. Kay and Bedivere, like a little group of player characters, right? An adventuring party. We will go off. We don't need the entire army. You'd think an army would be useful in facing down a grotesque ogre-like creature. Maybe that bunch of archers over there would be really useful. A volley of arrows would deal with it." No. That is not King Arthur's idiom. He goes off on his own to face it in single combat because that's what heroes do. Of course, he defeats the creature. And so he avenges the dishonour of the girl. He demonstrates to the Duke of Brittany that he, the great king, can protect the Duke where the Duke was unable to protect himself. He proves that he's the greatest of all kings, that he succeeded where these other 20 failed. And he does this in this weird supernatural setting. If we like using the word liminal, we're going to say that Mont Saint Michel, where the fight takes place, is a kind of liminal space. It's a weird geographical feature. It's between land and sky, between earth and sea. And so in this odd liminal place, he slays the villain, restores order, shows his prowess and greatness. Now, when we are creating stories, role-playing game adventures for a modern audience, this presents us with certain problems. If you've watched the other videos in this series, you'll know that for the Medieval Knights anthology, we're mainly taking things that were recounted as true stories, things that chronicle writers or similar people said, "Oh, this thing definitely happened." Well, those stories have to make some basic sense in the world. The Arthurian stories don't. If you're listening to an Arthurian story as a medieval audience, as a medieval listener, it's a bit like a modern person watching a Marvel movie, a superhero movie. You know this wouldn't actually happen. Yes, it's sort of set in your world, but it's all totally over the top and ludicrous, right? This Arthurian story of King Arthur and the Giant of Mont Saint Michel, works as a kind of literary narrative piece that teaches you important things about King Arthur. But it doesn't really make sense. Why did he leave his army behind? That's ludicrous. Now, we could run this pretty well exactly as written. That would depend on the rules and the attitudes of our players, but maybe we can make it work. Maybe for a high-level D&D party, your high-level party are incredibly powerful. The army, though, with them are all first level. If they take them into the battle with them, you give the big bad some sort of area effect spell that just kills all of the mooks, all of the soldiers, and so the heroes have to deal with the fight. Maybe you're playing in a very literary, self-conscious way where you're trying to recreate these heroic narratives. You're doing a sort of Pendragon-like heroic Arthurian game where, of course, the players know that they shouldn't take the army with them because that's not what heroes do, and they play to the tropes. That could work. But for most role-playing groups, we're going to need this to make sense. And if we just strip out the stuff that doesn't make sense, we're actually left with something really boring, which is a shame because it's a cool story. So if we say, okay, we're not going to have an army there, what's going to happen is the player characters are going to be asked to find the kidnapped daughter. They're going to discover she's dead. They're going to face the big bad. It's a big ogre monster giant thing with a big club, and they defeat it in a combat encounter. That's boring. Right? We can write that by rolling dice on a random encounter table. We can ask an LLM to come up with something. You go to an LLM and say, you go to Claude or Copilot and say, oh, give me a story based on the Arthurian legend of King Arthur and the giant of Mont Saint Michel. It'll come up with something like that. Or you could roll some dice. You can roll the dice on this table that tells you who the victim is or what the plot hook is. The plot hook is rescue the girl, right? What's happened to the girl? Roll some more dice. Oh, she's dead. Right, so we now have to avenge her. Who's the big bad? Roll some dice on the big bad table and it comes up with an ogre or a giant. Right? You don't need human thought to do that, but it's really simplistic and it's really boring. And if we want to draw from and build on and create depth and interest from these medieval narratives, we're going to have to build around this. We're going to have to build some foundations for it, and we're going to have to make it interesting. Now, we, for Medieval Knights, are only doing this because it was a request. Somebody on a forum said, hey, can you do King Arthur or a story based on King Arthur and the Giant of Mont Saint Michel? And on that same forum thread, somebody was talking about Long Lankin. Now, Long Lankin is a folklore character. First appears in an 18th century ballad. So we're talking hundreds of years after the Middle Ages, right? This isn't a medieval story. And it exists in loads of folk ballads from the Appalachians and Scotland and Northumbria and so forth. And Long Lankin is a monstrous man, maybe ogre-like, maybe just a really unpleasant man, who breaks into the house of a local important person, sort of noble-ish person, and kills the wife and child. And in some versions, it's very much more the ogre, like our Mont Saint Michel giant. But in the Northumbrian versions, Long Lankin is a disgruntled mason, and he may be extremely strong and he may be extremely tough. But he is somebody who believes he is owed something by this powerful rich man. Well, we can use that. What if our giant, our ogre, instead of just kidnapping a girl because he's evil and we need somebody to do something evil so that King Arthur can come along and prove that he is the uber king, what if this character has a kind of twisted idea of what's right and what they're owed? They actually think they're owed this child, who they're then going to kill, and they think that's reasonable. Okay, we can work with that, and that then grounds it in actually this creature has its own motivations. Its actions make sense. And we can then take that further, because if what we're doing now is we're saying we're going to play with the idea of what is reasonable human interaction, what is reasonable social interaction, what are you owed? Right? What can you expect from other people? Then we can play around with this and construct a character which has a twisted notion of what friendship is, what debt is, what is reasonable to take in return for something, what a gift is. And so this character becomes a kind of twisted, grotesque version of social interactions. It thinks it's owed this girl, this child. Okay, now we've got an interesting grounding. We've built this on something, and we've built it on the medieval world, because we can play with the way that medieval people interacted with each other to create a grotesque version of that. Something else that's interesting in that story is the beards. Now, the idea of taking beards as trophies or tributes occurs in loads of stories. There's a Welsh legend with a giant on top of a mountain who takes beards and trophies. It's a while since I've read it, but if I'm remembering correctly, Arood's saga, which is one of the Scandinavian sagas, has a kind of grotesque, slightly superpowered champion who demands a tribute of beards. It's this idea of visibly taking the signifier of somebody's masculinity, depriving them of it, and wearing it as a trophy on a cloak. I think the Arood saga character wears it as a cloak. Here in the Arthurian legend, the beards are woven into cloaks. So we've got this idea of taking masculinity. And this is interesting because from a role-playing game, this telegraphs to the player characters what the superpower is and potentially what the weakness of the creature is. If its strength comes from these beards that it wears on the cloak, then the player characters can pick up on that and think, well, what if we deprive it of the cloak? So now we're making interesting problem solving or tactics rather than the Arthurian story, which is just there will be a one-on-one combat which shows how great the king is. Okay. And so we end up with what's quite a short adventure. It's still a little bit of investigation leading to a fight which might go very badly for the players, and they have to retreat, heal up, and then come back, depending on their game system, the next day or 3 months later, however long is appropriate. But this is something that players can engage with in a much deeper way than if we just ripped off the original story, but we've kept it all medieval. So it gives us empathise with the villain, but it's a grotesque villain and it's clearly still wrong. It gives us rooting in the world. It gives the players a way to feel more grounded in the world and understand the world. If they're looking at what is a twisted version of social interaction, this implies that they're building an understanding of what is normal social interactions. And we have some interesting powers which are telegraphed to the players so that they know that they should be thinking about getting around these powers, depriving the creature of its powers, and so forth. So that is how, for the Medieval Knights anthology, we've taken the Arthurian story of King Arthur and the giant of Mont Saint Michel, and we've turned it into something that's grounded, deeper, more tactically complex, and rooted in the world.